Venezuela was once the envy of much of Latin America, a nation with some of the world's largest proven oil reserves buried beneath its soil, a resource that promised wealth, development, and security. Throughout the 20th century, crude oil transformed the country's economy, shaping its politics, society, and identity. By the turn of the 2000s, petroleum accounted for nearly all of Venezuela's export revenue and a majority of state income, fueling ambitious social programs and government spending that appeared to lift millions from poverty. Yet within that promise lay a profound vulnerability, one that would only become clear as the nation's economic foundations began to falter under the weight of oil dependence and structural imbalance. During the early years of Hugo Chávez's presidency, the oil boom of the 2000s provided an unprecedented flow of petrodollars. Between 2004 and 2013, Venezuela's oil revenue was enormous, amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars, much of it funneled into social missions, national development funds, and political initiatives aimed at redistributing wealth and consolidating support for the Bolivarian Revolution. The state oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A. PDVSA, once among the most influential oil producers globally, became the financial engine of these programs, with nearly 96% of export income tied to crude sales. But this extraordinary reliance on oil masked deeper weaknesses. As oil revenue became the lifeblood of government budgets, other sectors of the economy languished. Agriculture, manufacturing, and domestic production were eclipsed by the vast inflows of petrodollars, weakening economic diversity and reducing incentives for structural reform. By 2012, oil accounted for an overwhelming share of exports and fiscal revenue, leaving the country extraordinarily vulnerable to fluctuations in global prices. With nearly every financial metric tied to oil, there was little buffer against downturns. The illusion of stability persisted so long as prices remained high and demand strong. However, an over-reliance on oil revenue meant that everyday government functions, social services, and import needs depended on volatile global markets. In such a context, broad economic planning became secondary to managing short-term revenue streams. The lack of diversification was not merely an economic oversight, but a defining characteristic of a petrostate that had harnessed resource wealth at the expense of sustainable development. Even as oil generated vast sums, it was also hiding the structural imbalance that would later emerge in devastating fashion. The first cracks appeared when global oil dynamics shifted. Beginning around 2014, crude prices, which had fueled expansive budgets throughout the Chávez years, plunged sharply. Where Venezuela had once benefited from elevated prices, the state now faced a sudden reduction in revenue. Without diversified income sources to compensate, government budgets strained under the weight of ambitious spending commitments. Between 2012 and 2020, oil income fell by more than 90%, a collapse mirrored by a dramatic drop in per capita income and economic output. Compounding this external shock were internal pressures within PDVSA and the broader Venezuelan economy. Years of mismanagement, political interference, and the replacement of technical experts with political loyalists eroded the state oil company's operational capacity. Skilled workers left or were dismissed, infrastructure aged without adequate maintenance, and production capability steadily declined. Once producing millions of barrels per day in the early 2000s, daily output had fallen precipitously by the late 2000s, leaving the state with diminishing export volumes precisely when revenue was most needed. Rather than adjust policies or diversify the economy, the government responded to shrinking oil income by expanding public spending through monetary expansion and inefficient exchange controls. Subsidies on gasoline and essential goods, once funded by oil revenue, continued despite dwindling funds, forcing the state to assign scarce foreign currency at artificially low rates. Inflation surged as the central bank printed money to cover deficits, initiating a vicious cycle that eroded savings and purchasing power. Hyperinflation emerged, with prices rising at astronomical rates, further destabilizing the economy and compounding shortages of food, medicine, and essential imports. This era of economic contraction was not simply a result of falling oil prices. The structural choices made during the boom, lack of investment in other sectors, failure to save for downturns, and politicization of state enterprises meant that the nation had no safety net. With oil revenue drying up and production plummeting, the Venezuelan state found itself unable to cover basic imports, public services, or fiscal obligations. The very prosperity that had sustained ambitious social programs now revealed itself as a fragile illusion, and with each passing year without diversified economic resilience, the nation inched closer to deepening crisis. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, the consequences of oil dependency were unmistakable. Where once Venezuela had been a leading oil exporter and a symbol of resource wealth, it now faced an economy in contraction, with output, public services, and living standards drastically deteriorated. The state's reliance on crude left it exposed to the full force of market volatility, and without fiscal buffers or economic alternatives, the impacts were felt acutely across society. Thousands of businesses closed, unemployment rose, and millions of Venezuelans sought stability abroad. Internationally, the collapse reverberated through geopolitics and energy markets. With Venezuela's crude output reduced to a fraction of its historic levels, its influence in global oil circles faded. While the country still holds some of the world's largest reserves, the decay of infrastructure, underinvestment, and political instability made rapid recovery difficult. Foreign companies remained wary of investing without legal protections and stable governance, further delaying meaningful revitalization of the sector. The deterioration of PDVSA and the broader oil industry served as a cautionary tale of how mismanagement and structural dependence on a single commodity can erode a nation's competitive position. The social repercussions of the collapse were equally profound. Hyperinflation devastated household economies, rendering savings worthless and imports scarce. Hospitals struggled to obtain supplies, and daily necessities became luxuries for many. The promise that oil wealth could continuously provide for the nation's needs dissolved under the pressures of global market shifts and domestic missteps. While debates continue about the interplay of sanctions, politics, and economic policy, the core lesson remains clear. When a country ties its fate too tightly to a single resource, especially one as volatile as oil, it risks profound instability if that resource's value falters. Understanding how oil money masked Venezuela's deeper vulnerabilities is not only essential for explaining this particular collapse, but offers a broader lesson in economic planning, resource governance, and the importance of diversification. Lessons that reach far beyond the borders of any single nation.